Hello, everyone. Hope you enjoyed last week's episode on layoffs in the tech industry. If you haven't had a chance to listen or watch that, we suggest going back and checking that out. That was an amazing episode with a lot of insights. We are back with episode 2 with the same gang. Today, we are going to discuss how technical should engineering managers be. But before we get into that, let's do a quick round of intros. My name is Keyur Hindocha. I'm an engineering manager at a healthcare company. I've been a manager for about 5, maybe 6 years now.
Hey everybody, my name is Vic. I am a principal engineer at Twilio Segment. Before that, I was a staff engineer at Eventbrite, and I've formerly been an engineering manager and engineering director.
Hey, my name is Mitra. I went into management 2.5 years into my career as a software engineer, and I've been a manager at big companies like Amazon, at startups like Pave, and everything in between.
Hello, everyone. I'm Louis, engineer, former engineering leader, turned entrepreneur recently. Happy to be with you all.
Hello, folks. I'm Thiago, currently Director of Engineering at Nubank. I have been on the engineering management side for a little bit over 6 years now. Before Nubank, I was at Apple, and then before that was at American Express.
All right, so let's jump right into it. So before we get into how technical engineer managers should be, let's set the stage and define what the role means. Engineering managers can vary in their roles and responsibilities depending on the size of the company, depending on the domain, depending on the complexity of the overall product and the stack. So maybe let's level set on what you guys think engineering managers do for like a day in life for an engineering manager.
Okay, so whenever I try to explain engineering managers, I try to break it down into 4 dimensions of the job, the 4 Ps. So engineering manager, in my view, is responsible, of course, for the people side, for the process side, right? Process involves also culture. It also involves many other things. The product or the delivery side. And 4th, the platform or the engineering side involves architecture and all that. So I think if you play those 4 dimensions, I think some engineering managers might be a little stronger on the people management side, some more on the platform, on the core engineering side, some more on the process. But I feel in order to be effective as an engineering manager, you need to be a little bit, at least in those 4 Ps.
Got it. So that is a good definition. Companies often also have technical product managers or technical project managers that wear a similar hat where they are involved in the technical details, but maybe not as deep as some of the other roles would be. And then same on the product side. They understand the business and the value given to the customers, but they may not be as deeply involved depending on the person, depending on the role, and depending on the company's expectations of their role. So have you guys seen TPMs in your companies, and how do they differ from engineering managers in your experience?
I think basically we had a couple of TPMs on my teams, and mostly, at least in my teams, they were responsible for interfacing between core organizational technical teams, making sure that our technical debt and things that needed to be upgraded and basically tech-driven projects were sort of seen through. I would say they had very little responsibility in terms of sort of interfacing with the business and figuring out what the core product that the end customer consumes is. As teams get bigger, you have a huge need for people like this that can basically keep track to make sure that you're upgrading your Kafka libraries or whatever technical debt you have, that you're conforming to the standards of the rest of the org. But then these people have basically no responsibility when it comes to career decisions of anybody on the team. Although, I mean, obviously they have input, right? Like I'm working with Louis. I asked Louis to glue in this brand new library that the libraries team built, and he hasn't done it. For weeks. Said he would. That's bad. So I mean, they have that kind of input, but usually they would raise those concerns to the manager. Although I haven't seen that too much. But the point is that they're not really responsible for people's careers, at least from what I've seen. They do work with product managers, that are actually on feature development because they need to slot in this technical debt somewhere in the team's velocity and all of that. And so there's usually some back and forth and some negotiation and tech leads are involved and the manager's involved, but usually that's where they fit. And I'd say, in a very, very early stage startup, they probably, aren't very useful. But as the team gets bigger and bigger, they become really useful because teams, accumulate technical debt. The bigger the code base gets, the more things, oh, we'll do later. And then eventually the debt comes due, right? And so you got to pay it down. And these folks are very good for tracking that and collaborating, right? Because a lot of technical debt requires you to work across teams. That's sort of my 2 cents on what a TPM is versus a manager. So I think TPMs do have to be technical. Usually, I mean, on my teams, they could almost pass the engineering interview. So some of them could pass the engineering interview and decided to go off this track because they enjoyed the project management more. But usually TPMs are pretty technical, and although they're not necessarily writing code themselves, they have to understand architecture and how these things fit.
Yeah, I mean, I would add, I think they usually don't have people reporting to them. They might have other program technical project manager, but I think that's one big difference. And I would say also their responsibility on the platform side, on the engineering, is mostly to drive things to completion, not necessarily to make sure the next big technology is coming. They might go after tech debt, as you said, Louis, but they're more trying to follow through and make sure the work gets done and who needs to be involved gets paged, right? But they are not really in the weeds as the engineering managers, talking to engineers, trying to figure out how to do it, right? And they are really process driven, right? They might help set up like different tracking mechanisms, right? They know enough about the business, but they are not as deep in the business side as product managers, for example.
Agreed. I think it's required when you have a big product org and a big engineering org, and there's often multiple teams that require coordination in order to get your deliverable out the door. They are, at least the good ones, you'll see TPMs great at process, great at rallying troops, great at making sure that different teams that have different responsibilities are able to get together and march to the same beat. So they have that overarching responsibility to make sure that the different teams, both the technical and the non-technical ones, work together in order to get it out the door. I've also seen BAs, business administrators, or BSAs as they're called in some domains, that also help with some aspects of this job. Sometimes there's a little bit of an overlap depending on the domain. So some banking industries, some telecommunication industries have BAs that help with some of the requirements, some of the project management, not as technical sometimes, but often work hand in hand with the TPMs to help the engineering teams get proper requirements and work closely with the engineering manager to make sure that the teams that the manager manages has sufficient work and it is already prioritized. Requirements are clear before the engineering teams jump on and start working on it.
A lot of what you described, I, at least early in my career, assumed that was just part of an engineering manager's role. I had actually never really worked in a company where, at least around my team and my org, we had TPM. So it was just assumed that an engineering manager is going to do this work, like the process, like working collaboratively with other teams, rallying the troops, basically organizing your team, right? That's very much, at least I see, a big part of an engineering manager's job. I have always thought it's interesting, especially at a lower level where it's just an EM and, a few engineers, to also have a TPM and maybe also have a PM. It feels almost like too many cooks, but I'm curious, how that works out for folks. I think TPMs can be very useful at higher levels where you are, working across multiple different teams, but otherwise, I really think for engineering managers, it's hard to stay in the what without working on the how.
That's a good point. I don't think I've seen it in smaller companies or startups, but the more mature the company, or it's often companies that have legacy code or huge amount of technical debt that they have to service either due to government regulations or some compliance reasons, it requires a lot more coordination because now there are 6 layers of application that you must go through before you can get a response back up at the UI level. So I guess depends on complexity of the company and what legacy systems have been left behind that nobody wants to touch. And there are few pockets of experienced folks left behind that only people who have that knowledge. Again, I'm not saying this is the ideal way to do it, but that's what I've seen in my experience. So why should engineering managers be technical, and what advantages do they bring to the table if they are technical in terms of herding the teams, in terms of being able to coach and mentor?
All right. Why engineering managers need to be technical? I feel there are many reasons, but just to mention a few, I think one is in order to grow people and to be able to almost mentor them is super effective when you have had that experience, and also help them to be promoted or to manage low performers. I think if you are able to go and inspect the work a little bit and see how they're doing technically, I think you're going to be a lot more effective. I think the other one is, in order to kind of break down projects and set the next steps and divide the work, check if like the estimates are making sense, who can take more work, who is not doing great, right? I think is super, super helpful. Another thing is, if you're able to understand deeply how not the code base, but how the systems that your team maintain work, you can be in many meetings by yourself. You don't need to bring ICs to meetings. You can represent them. You can push back on leadership on crazy projects. And I think you can save everybody a lot of time. I think the last one is probably you also get more respect from the team if you're able to not argue with them on the at the code base level, but whenever you are able to make a contribution to bring something that nobody was thinking about that could end up on an outage or something like that.
I'm going to make many similar points to you. I'm definitely so I have loved my previous non-technical managers, but I think I have greatly benefited far more from technical managers than not. And, it's like, so as a principal engineer, right? So I'm the sort of the technical lead on the team. And I find that when I had a non-technical manager, I had a lot more meetings because I had to be the engineering representative at every one of those. And really, the manager and the tech lead are kind of two sides of the same coin. And it's completely true, right? Like they can represent the engineering interest at a meeting instead of just saying, let me take this back to the team and, and like find out for you what the team wants. They're able to push back on, on things that the team wants to do. I don't mean like in a calling bullshit kind of way, but I mean, they're able to constructively participate, right? And they're not lonely in team meetings where they don't understand what's going on. Like it's just a bunch of engineers talking about technical implementation details. They're actually able to participate in this. They're able to build their understanding of it, and they're able to take that back to other teams, and they're able to actually, represent the team. And also, it really, really, and I cannot state this enough, it really, really multiplies their impact on you as an IC if they're technical, because they're able to see, like what your flaws are. Maybe you are coming into an SDD and like, I don't know, taking shortcuts with it or whatever, or they're able to see, what other parts of your career that you need to grow at. Louis?
Let me just jump in there. I think there's 2 points I want to add to this, right? I think you guys covered some really, really great points already, but I think the big one is empathy, right? Like if you've done the job before, you just have this nuanced understanding, because a lot of times, you get some task or someone let's say someone gets stuck on a task because it's an unknown, right? Like we've never worked with this technology. We have no idea what's happening. It turns out it's taking way longer than we thought. And a lot of times what happens in that situation is the business pushes back, right? They say, why is this taking so long? Like we've been waiting for this, like we're desperate for this. And if the manager's not technical, it's really difficult to turn around and explain and communicate exactly what's going on, right? So somebody doesn't get thrown under the bus, because they can empathize with the situation. They've been there. They've probably gotten stuck on some tasks, that seem really big. You get in there, you start doing it, you do it in a week. And then some tasks that you said were going to be really tiny, come back around and the thing turns out to be huge. And only an engineering manager that has had that will really empathize with that situation. I think a lot of other people won't, because it's just, what the hell's wrong with you? Aren't you supposed to know this? But it's not that simple, right? It's not that simple. And so I think empathy is a big one. And I've had, technical managers and non-technical managers. I think the higher up you go, the less required it is. But I've seen even like very C-level people, get frustrated, talking to a distinguished engineer because of this, right? And as the manager of that distinguished engineer, I've had to step in, right, and empathize with their situation, right? Like this is not somebody that is trying to, I don't know, say something crazy. They're literally, these are the reasons why they're struggling with this. And so I think that's a huge, huge deal, basically, that empathy. But there's one other point. I think judgment, right? And I recently tweeted this today. I think judgment's so important, right? As an engineering manager, a huge part of how you're going to move up is your judgment calls, right? You got two features to build, right? Feature A, everyone says is going to generate X in money. Feature B is going to generate Y. You have a vote as an engineering manager at that table with the product and all these other people. If you pick the right feature there, and the right feature is not necessarily the one that makes more money. The right feature is the one that could actually be done, right? One could take 6 months, one could take 1 month. As an engineering manager that's had that technical experience, you're going to make a gut call that's going to be so good in comparison to if you have no clue. If you have no clue because you've never dealt with the code base before, it's going to be very difficult for you to make that good judgment call. And I think people get promoted long term. The higher up you go, the more right you are on your judgment calls. If you're building a system and it adds no business value, you're dead. You're not going to get promoted for that. But if you build a system and you add a ton of business value and you are the interface for that, you have a huge vote as an engineering manager. So I really feel strongly that basically those two things are super important.
All really, really good, strong points and correct points. But I also think there's a caveat to think about. So in my mind, I think of engineering managers as not just that first level of managing a team of engineers. I think directors are engineering managers, VPs, CTOs, you're all engineering managers, just a larger scope, and maybe you're managing managers instead of engineers. But at the end of the day, you're still managing, a big group of engineers. And so I think there's a difference or details that we need to get into when we talk about technical versus non-technical. I think a lot of what we've been talking about so far as non-technical is purely never been a software engineer or never coded before or has no idea if you're given a GitHub link, like what to do with it. But then when we think of technical, like think of a new VP coming to your company. They haven't been in your code base and they likely won't be, but how do they stay technical? And what does that mean for them to be providing some sort of technical guidance or, good judgment calls? I think what Louis said is extremely important, that in any role, really, if you're able to make the right call, people are going to trust you, and that's how your impact and your scope expands. But I think specifically when we talk like technical versus non-technical and being an engineering manager, you need to make the right technical call. So that does require some level of understanding of even the stack that your team is working on and like how your deployments work. What's your development life cycle like? Are you in a monolith? Are you microservices? Like you need to understand the details of your architecture to be able to make certain calls. And if you don't really know that, then of course you can't say if something's going to take X amount of weeks or months or something will require multiple teams work or whatever it is.
I think we should dissect this further and see where this goes. So maybe technical is a very loose term, right? I could have come up the path of a front-end engineer and I understand Angular and React better than anyone else. I know all the nuances, but I have no idea about databases, or I have no idea about how any of the backend code works, right? So I'm technical. I made my way from co-op to staff engineer because that's what my passion was. And I'm very technical because I can whip up a new UI overnight and nobody else in the company can, right? Now, if I get assigned to manage a team that's entirely built of database developers, I'm still technical. I still know front-end development. Can I do a good job managing a stack, a team that I know nothing about?
So I think that if you're technical, there's a lot that we can abstract in terms of your ability to learn new things, right? Like I know if we pick front end as an example, but that's a rapidly changing domain where you are a continuous learner in order to stay, abreast of that field. I think when you are a continuous learner like that, it allows you to now be like, oh, my team uses microservices and Go with databases. That's a thing that I've been down a learning path before, and I can learn this new thing. I don't think that you have to be previously an expert at the exact stack that your team is using. And it's going to be very difficult to find that. I mean, 6 months ago, I had never worked in the stack that I currently work. And if an IC who's deeply embedded in the code is able to pick that up and learn it, a manager who does not need to get as much of the weeds can get decent enough of a cursory understanding to be able to help your team.
I'm offended on behalf of front-end engineers. Having done some front-end work, I am offended that you said that about them. I think they could learn back-end. They just choose to do front-end. At least all of the front-end engineers that I've ever hired were very could have easily become full stack, and some of them did, right? So anyway, I just wanted to say that because I'm sure we're going to have some listeners that are actually going to be offended by that, and I'm offended on their behalf, just having managed front-end people.
I actually feel like the back end is simpler. Like, there's a lot fewer choices that I'm having to make than I worked in the front end. It was rapidly changing. You're far more likely to succeed as a front end engineer who has to manage a back end team than a back end engineer who has to go manage a front end team.
This example was purely for illustration purposes. I do not mean to start any flame wars here. So there's another interesting point that comes up here. So we've often seen this as a pitfall, especially with new engineering managers. So somebody who is going from the IC track to being a manager for the first time, if they are promoted within their same team to go from whatever level they were at, let's say senior, staff, principal engineer, to being an engineering manager. So now they're having to manage their peers. Often the pitfall I've seen is that they have a very hard time letting go. They are still in the weeds, and obviously they know the domain better than anyone. They know the code base better than anyone. So they often jump into solution or to provide story points or to recommend which feature to build. So that really comes in the way of building self-empowered teams, right? For really enabling other engineers on the team to step up and make decisions. One alternative is that when you promote, you always put them on a different team. And then back to Vic's point, if you're a continuous learner, you can learn the stack, no problem. You can learn the domain, no problem. But if you are within the same team, it often hinders you from stepping into that manager role and doing a good job at it, where you're also responsible for your team, for their performance, for making sure that their work is called out to senior leadership.
This was my first foray into engineering management. I didn't manage my direct team, but I've seen it happen plenty of times. I was managing like a sister team. But I think a lot of it falls to that person's manager's ability to coach them well. Because I think what we often see is you take your best engineer and you say, go be the manager, and then that's kind of it, right? They don't get any sort of hands-on coaching or, support, because there's an assumption for some reason that engineering management is an extension of being an engineer versus a totally different job. And you need to learn how to do the different job. So I think in my experience, I was lucky to have a very hands-on manager who showed me that weekly updates are important. I should be spending a lot more time with my stakeholders and product managers than in any of the code. And if I'm doing any of the code or picking up any, Jira tasks, I'm actually stepping on my engineers' toes and not allowing growth opportunities for them. So you need to, I think, have good mentors and a good manager to shift your mindset and make it really clear what your new job is versus what your old job was, and help you make those decisions as you're learning.
Yeah, I was actually going to bring the other side of the coin that we kind of like got into now. What is the problem when you have an engineering manager that's too technical, right? That is not communicating enough, that's not doing people management, that's often reviewing every single PR and making folks do whatever they would do, whatever their way or the highway, right? And I think the other side of the engineering management job that's probably more important than being technical. And I would say there's also a good point to mention about engineering managers that are not too technical, but they compensate on the process side, on the people management, and they're able to build relationships and like get trust of the people and get by really effectively without understanding deeply things, right? I think it's possible, but I would say those are not good examples of super balanced engineering managers, like one that's like 100% on the code base, 100% on the platform side, the other one that's 100% on the people side, right? I think the really good, effective engineering manager is the one that's able to balance and able to go whatever is needed, right? And the other thing about being like a front-end engineer and managing a back-end engineering team, or being mobile and going on like, I don't know, like a completely different engineering side, I think like for engineering managers, I feel that almost like the part of the stack you can learn quickly, but I think the problems are usually on the boundaries, on the hotspots of the code base, whatever things break, right? So I think it's like as an engineering manager, you need to pay attention to what people are complaining, what are the root causes of outage, right? And go there where like the problem is and try to understand that part. And that might involve learn new technology, try to set up things on your local machine to get a feel of it. But I think the most important thing for engineering managers, I feel like architecture-wise, I like to use that C4 model because there are like 4 levels, right? There is the context, containers, components, and code, right? We're not talking about the code base. We're talking about, okay, what is the context around the ecosystem and what are the big containers? What are the big deployable pieces? And then inside each container, what are the big, let's say, components or models that you have? If you're able to get to that level and understand, okay, there is this system that does this thing, there is this system that's overloaded, you're able to navigate and speak the language of the engineer.
Yeah, I'll give a big plus one to that, and also add that I've seen the micromanaging, in action, right? Where the EM is on GitHub and they will look at every PR and they may even, comment on the PR. And then what happens there? Let's say you're an L2 who gets a comment from the engineering manager and you're going to accept the comment. You're going to do exactly what they say. You put yourself in there and exactly like what you said, on the one hand, they need to continue to remain technical, right? How do they get and stay technical? And some ways that they do that is they get in the code, they read PRs, they read your software design documents, they come to architecture meetings. They want to remain technical. But there needs to be a line somewhere, right? Where your participation should be this is a suggestion. My word is not law here. You have to make sure you tell the team that, and also then practice it. You don't go in submitting code because that's not your job. That's not what you were hired for. You were not hired to submit code, but also take care of people's careers. And and that starts to feel to the team like you're not doing your job. If you're pushing code, that means there's some part of your job that you're hired to do to take care of me and my career that you're not doing. You have become too deeply involved where you're not able to take a backseat and see exactly how the interactions between engineers are going. I mean, definitely want your input, but you gotta that's where you wonder, how do you stay technical? I mean, maybe and I've seen this done well. Oh, one more example. I had a former manager who would, when a SEV was declared, he would jump in and he looked at it as I'm protecting my team's time. And he would jump into the SEV because he was a very senior employee and he would fix the issue. I mean, this is problematic for one reason. One, that's not your job. But also, it meant that the other engineers were not learning. They were not able to. I mean, it's one thing if everything is down, holy crap, anyone needs to help. But it's another thing that's this is an issue that, we can push till tomorrow. It's not a big thing. There's no customer impact. And that is a learning moment for other engineers. And this sort of goes as well, right? If you're a team lead. If you're a team lead, once again, don't fix the thing that can be a learning opportunity for someone else.
I just had a personal confession to make. I used to work at a company where, as a first level manager, I had over 60 direct reports. So definitely not all 60 were full-time employees. Some were part of my team, some were contractors. So I wasn't doing year-end evaluations for all 60, but I was still responsible for the deliverables that the contractor teams were responsible for. So for this project, it was very crazy timelines, no wiggle room in terms of scope, and it had to be done. There was severe financial burden if we didn't meet these deadlines, right? So now over these 6 months, it was always firefighting of one issue after another. We were constantly in war rooms, and as a manager, I was constantly pulled, and I remember there were times when I was triple booked because there were 3 different war rooms going on with different parts. So I was obviously failing at my job to make sure that my team was cared for, and I was looking out for their well-being because I was going from one fire to the next day and night. So in this case, can you still be a good engineering manager because you are making sure that each fire is put out so that the rest of the team can continue to deliver? Or are you failing because you are not doing the principal purpose of your job, which is to make sure that your team is able to grow?
Did you ever feel like you were being betrayed by the organization who were effectively repurposing your role from an EM to an engineer and therefore, not hiring one more person, right, to alleviate your bandwidth?
I did. And there were definitely sleepless nights. There was definitely times when I was processing problems in my dream and waking up with a cold sweat saying, aha, this is how we should do it. So I knew that something had to change. But this goes back to the point, because it is, and again, given the current economy, companies are cutting back on how many engineers or engineering managers they are hiring. People, even in startups, people are wearing multiple hats. So you're often asked to do more than what your role is expected to define of you. So that's where I wanted to see in this case. And maybe this goes back to Thiago's point. Are you doing so well in one area that it eclipses, or you get by and you still get the respect and empathy that Louis and Vic spoke about, where the organization still values you as an engineering manager, even though I say that in air quotes, because you're still contributing, just not the purpose you thought you had at the company.
That example that Vic gave is so good. Imagine you're a junior engineer, and last night your manager woke up and fixed your bug. How would you feel the next day? I mean, just put yourself in that junior's shoes, right? For a minute. It would be pretty bad, right? Like, it would be pretty bad as a junior. You'd feel like crap. Like you've let your team down, you let your manager down, and so that's like a last resort, right? Like, if you have to do that as a manager, people aren't doing their job on your team. That's number one. Number two, it's like this being technical is a two-sided sword. It cuts both ways. If you go and you do that, you may not realize, we talk about empathy. You might think you might be helping. You're not helping. You're doing a lot of damage, to somebody potentially by doing that, right? Because it put yourself in their shoes, right? My manager had to fix my shit. That's terrible. That's terrible, right? You don't want to be in that situation. So you never want to put anybody in that situation. Let them fix their thing. Right. Let them get pride in doing their job well. Right. And so, these things happen. Right. And so it's definitely, it's a different job. And a lot of people struggle with that transition. So being technical is for sure a double-edged sword. It cuts both ways, and it can hurt you being technical. But so you got to use your judgment. You got to evolve your sort of your competency a little bit.
Yeah, I was actually going to go back to Keir's scenario because I think it's an interesting one. I think the important thing is being technical on the long term, but on the short term, right? Especially if you're joining a company that's scaling really quickly and you are having incidents after incidents, and all you're managing is like incident reports all day long. You're kind of like, I think that's what you have to do, right? And if you have some background, you're going to learn a lot of things that are going to help for the next season, right? Whenever things start to calm down, things get to stabilize, they're going to be able to use, even though during like a couple of months, you're fully not doing career development, not looking at the architecture, just like fire after fire, right? And the other thing that I remember seeing was when I was at American Express, I remember us having a new CTO coming from Amazon to join the company. And I was there to see how this person approached things. And I think like one really effective way to understand the organization is to go through the monitoring system, dashboards, alerts, right? And I remember one question that he asked on the very first meeting we had with him is like, how do I know if the app is up now? Like, how do I know if everything is working? Right? Oh, and then people say, oh, we look at the dashboard. No, how do I know now? The dashboards are like a minute or two behind. And like I had principal engineers, distinguished engineers, and like nobody could explain. And I remember being in multiple calls with the CTO, and he would like on like business unit reviews, whatever it was, he would ask the name of the person. I want you to explain how this system works, like in details now. And it was like shocking, like why that person was asking those kind of things. And like that raised the bar to a level where kind of like everybody was scared to join the call. You almost went to downhill. But I remember seeing that's like, and he had no idea of the technology you're using, or he had an idea of like some of the technology, but he was like going like and trying to debug the architecture by being in meetings and taking every opportunity he had with like the engineer directors or the engineers to explain, show code. And I think although that had some downsides, I think he was able to contribute by maybe helping everybody to see the problems, right?
I have a confession. So I am a former engineering manager who became an engineering director. in a company that still needed me to keep doing development. And so I was that person who would overwork on a weekend and be like, this feature is behind like a lot, and someone needs to jump in and put out this fire. You effectively start to, be the hero, and you start submitting code. And if you're an engineering director who's submitting code, I can assure you every code review is going to be like, looks good to me, right? So I was writing a lot of code and effectively completely not doing the other job that I needed to do, which was represent engineering to management, manage my line managers, any of that stuff. But what this really helped me understand was that being super technical and in the weeds is really what my passion was. It wasn't being an engineering director. And in that way, it was great because I was like, I'm going to go back to being an IC. But it wasn't great for the managers who didn't get mentorship. It wasn't great for them to have basically an absent boss who'd come in and just dump code on them over the weekend. And oftentimes wouldn't even wait to get a code review. I would just merge it in because I had admin access,
Yeah, that's the downside of having superpowers, right? Just by virtue of your title, you get approvals on your PR. Nobody questions it. You're supposed to know, right? You're a boss man.
And when you go into a meeting, right, and like an architecture meeting, and you say, why are we using Kafka for this? Why aren't we using SQS? You're not going to get pushback. People are like, oh, he's a super technical engineer. These are good questions he's asking, and we probably cannot. You end up stymieing the discussion, which I think is a negative of being super technical and then getting involved in, coming to every one of these meetings.
Yeah, I think it's often effective to ask open-ended questions or provoking questions slightly and force the team to think about it and make suggestions. Even if you know the answer, or even if you think you know the answer, this at least triggers engaging conversation. People get a chance to speak up, and everybody benefits, right? It's not just your viewpoint anymore, and everybody gets to chime in.
That's an excellent point, right? Like if you say, oh, did we consider other things? Why did we pick this? It's different from why didn't we use SQS? It's the same question, but one of them has a different, different gravitas behind it.
So a question that's often asked, and I think Mitra brought it up as well. So in your previous life, you used to code all the time, and you get better at your tools because you are in the weeds every day, right? You automatically pick up design patterns, you automatically have a certain way of doing things that is intuitive to you that would not be intuitive to a junior software engineer, right? For you, that's the right way to do things. But slowly you lose, you're not coding every day, so you lose that technical edge, I want to say, where you are still good, but maybe not as good as you used to be a few years ago. New version of the framework has come out, a new version of the library. There is newer functionality that you are not on top of. So what can you do as an engineering manager, as a continuous learner, or what are some tips to stay technical so that you can still contribute effectively in your role?
Yeah, so I remember reading an amazing thread that Gergely started this week about ways to stay technical as engineering manager. And I might be stealing some of the points that they made there. But I mean, myself, a few things that I try to do, and I have done this probably in every single place that I join as a manager. I think like the first thing is try to set up your local environment, even if you're not going to use it. And even if it is after 6 months, a year after you join, right? There'll always be like a doc on how to set up the dev environment, right? And just going through that and having to like run a few repos and like to try to run up a few services locally, you're gonna already see, okay, those are the most important things, here's how things work. The other thing that I try to do that has helped me in a lot of places is whenever I'm usually using the product as a user, right? Whenever there is something that's like bothering me a little bit, or there is a bug that I know is really low priority, I pick that up and I try to like debug to get to a point where I know like where exactly in the code base, what methods, what thing is actually causing that behavior to be that way. And like how to change it. Not really going that far of opening a pull request, right? But just like, okay, get that feeling, put some breakpoints and debugging it is like, okay, here we go, is here. And like, in order to do that, you're gonna have to look at the logs, like you're gonna have to kind of like navigate on like, oh, this system called this system that depends on this database. And like, it might be a super simple thing. The other thing that I have been lucky enough to join places that have a lot of documentation, a lot of like architecture diagrams, a lot of like C4 models, is just spend a lot of time reading those stuff and like leverage your one-on-ones to ask folks, hey, can you explain how this works? Or even like look at the dashboards you have on Grafana, on like Splunk, whatever it is, and start to ask questions like, okay, why is the P99 of this service way so high? Like, what's happening? What other system is happening? Or try to find what is the system that everybody calls, right? There's usually a hotspot somewhere, and try to understand what that system does, who maintains that. I think those things are really helpful, and they're going to help you to navigating the org.
On that note, I think more often than not, you'll find places that have good documentation architecture diagrams, but they're most likely out of date and haven't been updated in a very, very long time. So I think one thing is redo the architecture diagram for current day. And I think that's a great way of learning when you're a manager of even just your team, right? Or if you're in a bigger company, do just your org or like your subset of a team. If you're at a startup, I recommend doing the whole company's architecture diagram and see what you can piece together. You'll naturally have to talk to tons of people because of it. You'll probably be chasing down tons of different docs. And I just think it's a great way to level up your own understanding of how everything works, and will just give you really solid foundations, not to mention just such a huge improvement to, the engineering org as a whole.
I think taking on, right, as an engineering manager, you show up to these sprint plannings, you show up to the daily stand-ups. People usually in these engineering teams, usually, depending on how they divvy up the tasks, they usually volunteer for something. They might play poker to assign it and give them points and all of that, right? Depending on the team and how they run things. There's always these tasks that no one wants to do. I mean, they're just like boring, right? Like they're just grunt work, and no one wants to touch it because it's like there's so many higher priority things. I think as an engineering manager, you could, as long as something not in a critical path, not going to block anybody, if you stumble with it, if you get caught up in meetings and you don't get to do it, it wasn't going to get done anyway. So, I mean, I think volunteering for those kinds of tasks is actually not that bad. And in that way, again, not in the, it might take you twice as long as one of the better devs on the team, but you're gonna understand the code base, right? Because you're committing code. So, I mean, I do think there is value to that, right? And it's very, again, if you do it right, you're not going to piss anybody off. You're not going to step on any toes, and people are actually going to be happy with you because you're taking something that they don't want to do. I mean, they hate the thing. And I think it's you kind of have to love grunt work to do it. But I've done it a lot of times, and I think it's a really, really good way to to stay relevant.
Yeah, I think these were some great suggestions today. I think there's a lot of takeaways for me personally, things that I need to do to be a better engineering manager. So great conversation, team. So make sure you don't micromanage. Make sure you don't jump into providing solutions. Don't create PRs after hours and on the weekends when your team is not around. Stay technical, remain a continuous learner, and keep progressing. You will get the respect. You will get the empathy from your team. Love it. Love it. Thank you, everyone. See you next week.
Cool.